Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another Breakfast with Blaha. And today I'm having fat-free Greek yogurt, almond butter, and milled flax seeds. Pretty common, one of my normal breakfasts. So, let's talk a little bit about bands and chains. Most of you, at least if you follow my channel, follow any of the conjugate stuff, you have some working idea behind why bands and chains work for max effort work and why they specifically work for speed work. But it doesn't mean that they don't have a role in hypertrophy, because you guys will notice on some of my training vlogs, a lot of my hypertrophy exercises, I will use bands and chains. Right? I even specifically bought a belt squat from Bales of Steel that has band pegs on it. Right? Got that specifically. So the question becomes, how does it help with these things? Before we jump into it too much, I think it's important that people understand the difference between bands and chains. People have this idea that, oh, they just help lockout strength. It makes it heavier at the top. That's not actually true with bands. Okay, that is true with chains. And if you look at it that way, you're right. But it's not a, hey, bottom versus lockout. It's a linear strength curve. Okay, chains allow you to create a linear strength curve. In other words, every inch or centimeter that the bar lifts when the chains are loaded correctly adds the same amount of weight all the way to the top. Okay, so if you have 50 pounds or 50 kilos, whichever units you use, it doesn't matter. If you have a setup to where it's unloaded at the bottom, it adds 0 at the bottom and 50 at the top, that means exactly in the middle it's going to have 25, right? And if you go a little further down, you go a fourth of the way up. It's going to have 12, 13, right? It's going to be a linear curve. And oftentimes that matches the natural strength curve of our joints. And we'll get over to that in a minute too. Bands do not work this way. They're dynamic, okay? In fact, a lot of times with bands, we run tension at the bottom. So with bands, it has an exponential strength curve. And then it has an overspeed eccentric effect. Totally different. So in other words, with bands, let's say you've got the 50 units of bands. You might have 10 at the bottom, because there's going to be some tension, and it hits 45 by the midway point, maybe even close to 50. So if it's 50 at the lockout, and there's a little tension at the bottom, it's going to reach 90% of that tension by the halfway point. So it's not just lockout, it's real fast, right? So I mean, that curve is being added very, very quickly. And then it slows as the bands stretch further and further. Now, what also happens when the bands get stretched, it creates an overspeed effect. When you reverse the weight, like you go up to press or deadlift or whatever, even do a curl, it jerks on the bottom. It jerks on the way back down. Okay, that creates a larger eccentric response. Again, how many people out there think about eccentric loading and talk about eccentrics for hypertrophy? You have that, and this is the reason band work against heavy bands makes you more sore, causes more micro tearing of the muscles. All right, so why does this matter for hypertrophy? Well, number one, it gives us variation. It's one of the things I've said oftentimes. Exercise variation produces better hypertrophy. Having a couple different lifts, rotating lifts. This is not my opinion. The research shows there's potential for slightly more muscle. Right? Exercise variation gives us a little more hypertrophy. In other words, if you only try to use one exercise to build a muscle, just one, you're probably not going to reach your maximum size. And I think most people out there who've been training a long time have figured it out. They're like, man, my chest won't grow to as big as possible off just one movement. Right? My lats, my biceps, whatever, your quads. They need more than one exercise to reach their maximum development. Not saying they can't get good development off one, they certainly can, but it's not going to maximize it. This gives us variation. Number two, injury prevention. Right? If you're getting hurt or you're getting inflammation, right? Inflammation in your tendons, it's harder to train, it's harder to gain muscle. Having variations of an exercise reduces overuse. What's the number one cause of injuries in the weight room? Most experts agree here. We're talking medical experts. Overuse. By rotating movements, we can do that. Bands and chains take the same barbell and the same exercise and change it. Now, even more importantly, from an injury perspective, again, airplane all the time, 2 a.m. Where do you have the most tension? Usually at the bottom of most exercises. Think about a bench press. Most tension on the pecs. Also the most tension on the tendon. Right? Same thing with a squat. Quads and stuff are stretched at the bottom. This is also the point where we have the highest overuse. All right. With these, we can change the strength curve to where there's a little less tension at that point. And I'm not saying there aren't benefits to having that tension. Understand, that's the point of peak mechanical tension. That's kind of an important point for hypertrophy. But if we want to give it a break, switching to bands or chains or rotating through them, right, what does it do? Unloads that area's weight just slightly. Lets that inflammation recover. What? By still having a normalized strength curve. Right? You're still going to have a strength curve that has a similar level of total resistance through the range of motion because it's lighter at the bottom, heavier as it goes up. We can get similar levels of muscle stimulus while unloading those areas and similar levels of perceived exertion. Can also more normalize the strength curve as our muscles do not need the same amount of contractile force all the way up. In other words, as we go up, the pecs have to produce less and less force near the top. We're adding weight near the top. We're now making the muscle fibers work harder through those ranges of motion than they might normally work. We're going to hit a few different new muscle fibers. Comes back to that point of variation. All right. This gives us a lot of hypertrophy potential now. People say, well, I don't have access to bands and chains. Yes, you do. All right, chains I get. A lot of people don't want to buy chains and pack them to the gym. So I've known people who do, though. What about bands? Bands are cheap. Good bands are cheap. I have hundreds and hundreds of pounds of band tension. I don't just have a couple sets of bands. You guys have seen my band wall. A lot of bands. Good bands are not that expensive. And a little bit can go a long way. You can get a few sets of smaller mini bands and take them in your gym bag. Most gyms have band pegs. If not, there are extra safeties on the rack. You can wrap them around. You can tune these bands. You can attach them to dumbbells, to plates. All right, it's not that hard. It really isn't. And the same thing if we want to not deal with the overspeed effect, you can reverse your bands. You can hang them underneath the bar. You can do it not just for benching, squatting, deadlifts, rows, whatever. You can do it for things like JM presses. You can do it for tricep extensions with a barbell. In a rack, you can reverse the bands. Right? Every one of you can set up bands. If you have racks and benches, you can set up bands, whether it's at home, whether it's at the gym. You just have to be creative. So even if chains are not viable for you, bands are. And you can't claim that they aren't. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.